And I just want to say a massive welcome and thank you so much for coming. It's really great to see so many of you because you're about to take the first step on a big journey to learning some important life skills. So it's really great to see you all here. Just to start off, I want to say, what a broad demographic. I mean, I can see we've got some achingly youthful people dotted around. So let's not get too jealous about that. And I was just saying to the others that we're going to start with a placement test, which some of you have seen just in front of you. So that's the white piece of paper just in front of you. Don't look at it yet. We're not going to start yet. We're going to key. But basically, this placement test is just to get a good gauge for us of your ability, because we're going to be splitting you up into assessment-based groups later on. So it's just really good that you're in the right group for your ability level, so you can help each other out. Okay. So usually, we'd take 15 minutes for this test, but as there's been a little bit of a hoo-ha getting in, we're going to take 5, but I just want to say, you're all going to be fine. I'm sure you're all very intelligent. So the most important thing is, no, don't quite start yet, Geoff. Geoff is always the key. Let's just say, can you all put your phones in the box, please?
The red boxes at the front.
The red box is in the front because this is a test. It's not to check your adroitness at search on Google.
So no.
Okay. So also another important thing, please write your name and your surname on the test. And when you're finished, please can you give them to Andy? Where's Andy? Well, Andy and Rachel will be sitting at the front here, and they'll be marking your test. So as soon as you're done, please get up and give your test to Andy and Rachel sitting in the front. Okay? Anyway, it's really easy, so I'm sure you will be fine. Let's start the 5 minutes now. Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So please, could you put your pens down? And look, it's just a gauge of your intelligence, which I'm sure is very high anyway. So if you could just hand your papers in to Rachel and Andy, and then they're going to sit at the front whilst I give this presentation. Okay? Because from these test results, from your marks, we'll be putting you into assessment-based groups so that you can give your presentations in the right ability level. Okay. So I just want to say a huge welcome to all of you. I know, thank you so much for completing the level test. I know it can be a bit daunting, especially as it will have been quite a while since a great number of you have entered into the classroom, but well done on getting stuck in. So how did you all find it? I noticed you finished quite early, sir. How did you find it?
No, I didn't finish early. I didn't finish at all.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was actually talking to this man in the white shirt. Sorry.
Quite easy.
Yeah. Pretty easy. Yeah. Yeah, it was. Imagine you were having a little bit of difficulty, were you? Yeah.
I found the first one quite...
Yeah, it was a bit mathsy, wasn't it? And well, the thing is, we ladies can sometimes feel like we've got a bit of a difficulty with maths, but actually we can all do it. So, the next part of the session is a bit more creative, so you'll probably thrive there. Okay. So I just want to introduce myself. My name is Louisa Holway. This is my colleague Rachel Lincoln, and we are teachers at BX College. And it's so great to see so many of you giving education another go. And here to learn this great class on mimodynamic theory. So, what is mimodynamic theory? I know you know Jess. Jess and I did this class last week, so she should know. Thank you. So, anyway, you'll all keep up and don't worry. The most important thing here is to just start making notes because you'll be giving presentations later on. So, how's the marking coming along? Yes. Okay, so don't worry about that. They'll just be marking whilst I give this presentation, and you'll get your results soon enough. So, mimodynamic theory. Has anyone got any idea as to what mimodynamic theory might be. Yeah?
Is it something to do with movement?
Not quite. Anyone else? You found the test quite easy. Maybe you can do this one?
Mime means mimic, mime,
And what is mime?
recreation.
Exactly. And what do you think dynamic could be?
Movement, energy.
Exactly. That's really interesting. You're on the right path. So basically, mimodynamic theory is about recreating the qualities of something that could be considered static. So the théorie mimodynamique comes from the theatre practitioner Jacques Lecoq's exploration of the links between movement and space, which came from his athletic training. So he started to see that movement could take on a certain amplitude and occupy a certain space. And he was looking at the world around him, and he was questioning the qualities of inanimate objects and the qualities that physical entities could possess, such as, this bottle of water or... Sorry, is there a problem?
I just don't see how this is relevant to me or anything. I don't know how it's relevant
Yeah,
to my life.
okay. Jess, do you want to...
I mean, it seems like it's relevant if you're working in advertising, say, and thinking about colours, or just anyone thinking about colours in their everyday life, like choosing how to set out their apartment or choosing what to wear.
That's
and
not
things
anything
like that.
to do with mimodynamic theory, that's just having eyes.
Okay, if you want to say something, maybe share it with the group or put your hand up or something, but we're just going to have to move on. And I just want to say now, if any of you found the placement test quite difficult, what's coming up is quite complex, so just make sure you do take notes, because it can get a bit tricky, okay? Great. So, where were we? We were with mimodynamic theory. And so mimodynamic theory is really a way of getting you all thinking a bit more creatively in groups. So, Lecoq had this idea that tout bouge, which is of course at complete odds with Nietzsche's idea that alles ist leer, alles ist gleich. No, for Lecoq, tout bouge est constant. So, he started to see in colours that colours have this particular movement. Yes, sir?
Can we have it in English? I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm not a lingual Brit.
Or would you like it in French? No.
Yes, I wouldn't.
Well, so Nietzsche had he thought there was nothingness, whereas for Lecoq, everything was in this constant state of movement. So we see this in colours as well. So colours have this particular movement inherent within them, and a space that they occupy. But this inherent movement and this space is in a constant state of transformation. So how are we all doing? We just keep making notes. Okay, so let's move on. So these are the two questions you need to ask yourself. How much space does the colour occupy, and how does it move? So let's start with red. So we might think that with red, it's a large, expansive colour, but in Lecoq's thinking, red is actually the second smallest colour. That means it occupies a small amount of space. And the movement, and the reason why, is the quality of red. Red is the colour just before the explosion. So it's a very dynamic movement within red, which has this intensity. Okay? So we can see that. Now let's move on to orange, which is the smallest, which also has quite a similar explosive quality to red, but it's moving in these straight lines. There's a lot of angular, stretching, directional, forward. I'm not going to spend too much time because I'm sure you're getting this. And moving on to yellow. So yellow is third largest. It's expansive, it's taking up space, soft, curves, floating. It's almost like breath, okay? Green is the third smallest. It's angular, it's bending, jagged. We can all see that. I'll get to you in a second. Wait 1 second, thank you. And blue. So blue is the second largest, which is occupying this great amount of space. It's weighty, it's low down, it's almost as if it's mist. There we are. And indigo is the largest. It's slow, it's long, it's almost regal, it's gliding. And finally, violet, which is of course circular. So I think Rachel and Andy have finished marking your test, so they're just going to put you into your assessment-based groups so you can do the next exercise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louisa. Okay, we've had we haven't had much time to mark them, so we'll try our best. If there's anyone that isn't called out, we will find a table for you. So, table 1. In table 1, we have Arias, Vilovich, Kamal. Few of you haven't read out. Okay, so if you don't mind coming up to the front, and we'll find you a place.
And the rest of you, can you move onto those tables that... Okay, so now you're all sitting down. Rachel is going to give us instructions on the next exercise.
Okay, everybody. On your table, Andy is going to come round and give you pictures and a bar that looks like this. A little bit like this, but it wouldn't be coloured in. So, what we're going to be doing is using what you've learnt from the presentation about hemodynamic theory and what you've learnt about colours and their dynamics, you are going to analyse the pictures that we put down on your table. Using what you've learnt, using the attributes of the colours, and you're going to colour in this bar. You're going to use every one of the colours of the rainbow. On your tables you have pencils, colouring pencils to use. So for example, I have coloured this one here, I coloured in lots and lots of green. This was a cubist painting by Brack. And as you can see, using cubism, use lots of angles, and green angles, so angles, lots of green, as you can see. So in your groups, discuss together, and you'll be colouring in your bars. So off you go.
And make sure that you'll be doing, a presentation afterwards. So if you can do this as quickly as possible, and then nominate someone in your group who will talk and present your findings.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start now. Thank you very much. I think maybe we should start. Should we start presentation for table 1? Show us how it's done. They've done such a brilliant job. And then we could do table 5. Can you stop colouring in, please? Okay. Yes. So take. How was it? I am so sorry, but we're actually not going to have time to do your presentation. I'm sure that's a shame for a lot of you, but we just want to say thank you so much for being such a great class today. And we think that you've all been such good sports. We just want to give you all a certificate of mimodynamic theory. And thank you so much. And we're just now going to hand over to Z Soon, who's going to be leading the rest of the session.
Okay, with that huge sigh of relief that I'm feeling around the room, I imagine not just that sigh of relief, no doubt some confusion, and I'm certain some challenge all to your comfort zones. The immersive part of this session is now over, but the interactive part is just about to begin. So before I jump into that, into the reflection part of this particular session, can I give a huge thanks to our actors come teachers, Louisa and Rachel, and not to mention, you may or may not have noticed, the various classroom plants on your tables as well. So before I jump into everything else, can we just give them a round of applause? So I'm Z Soon, head of the Behavioural Insights team's Education and Skills area. I hope you enjoyed your visit to the fictional BX2015 college. First of all, as you may have gathered, we have tried to take you back into the learning environment. Everything you would have experienced was deliberate, and hopefully you felt that all and saw it in through the interactions. I'm actually told hemodynamic theory is actually a real thing. I don't exactly know what it is, but I'm told it's actually a real thing. I think obviously this session was hypothetical, and somewhat of a caricature of the educational experience, but we really wanted to show you how small things, even with engaged teachers, motivated, well-intentioned teachers, that some unexpected outcomes can have an impact on the educational experience of learners. So I guess moving on, so this next part of the session will go from that immersive to that interactive, as I mentioned before. I will shortly invite the panellists to the table where I will sort of get them to reflect on some of the session, as well as invite you all as participants in this interactive exercise to really reflect on that opening session. This will go for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then I'll invite our panellists to do a short presentation to help really bring together some of this discussion. And as I sort of introduce the speakers who will emerge from the audience, it'd be great if you could join us as I introduce this. So the first one is Geoff Cohen, who is the James Smarts Chair of Organisational Studies in Education, Business, and a Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. Jeff's research aims to further our understanding of the processes underpinning social problems and that solutions to alleviate them. One area of interest addresses the effects of group identity and educational achievement, with a focus on underperforming students and racial gender achievement gaps. So Geoff, if you can join me on the stage, that'd be great. So the next person I want to join us is Fiona Morey. So Fiona is a Vice Principal of Learning and Quality at Aylesbury College, a prominent further education college here in the UK, leading on the development of our employer-led, student-focused curriculum. So if I can invite Fiona to join us on the stage, Fiona to join us on the stage, that'd be terrific. And last but certainly not least, can I invite Anna Vignoles to the panel. She's a Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge. She's also a Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and a Visiting Professor at the Institute of Education. She has published widely on widening participation in higher education and on the socio-economic gap in pupil achievement. Her research interests include issues pertaining to equity in education, school choice, school efficiency, and economic value of schooling. Anna has advised numerous government departments, including BRT, including DfE, BIS, and Treasury. She also provided advice for several reviews, including the Brown Review of Higher Education and Lord Leach's Review of Skills. So if you can join us, Anna, that'd be great. So as I was mentioning before, for the next 20 or 30 minutes before we move into some sort of more set-piece presentations, what we really want to do is have an interactive sessions between the panelists themselves and some of their reflections and their experiences, as well as yourselves as participants. So I've got my colleague Andy over there with her roving mic, who can allow you sort of to answer questions or make statements about how you felt, how you thought the opening exercise worked, and hopefully we can get our panelists to reflect on some of those comments as well. But just to get things started, I may open up with the first question. So Fiona, coming from the college environment and really sort of on the coalface of that experience, what did you think of that opening session? Did you see anything that particularly resonated with you? So I'll bring over a mic.
Okay. Hello, is that working? Yeah. I think in many senses there was quite a degree of exaggeration and caricature that I hope you would recognise would not be typical. But I think underlying that were the subtle things that teachers often do and say unintentionally that have a negative impact on learners. So while it was exaggerated, I think there was lots that we could recognise. And certainly being a learner in that session, as soon as the word test is mentioned, I think I certainly experienced a degree of anxiety, and I imagine quite a lot of people in the room would also experience that feeling. So I think we start with that anxiety that learners bring into the classroom and have to work with that.
Brilliant. So I might just invite Geoff and Anna to have some initial reflections before I throw over to the group.
I thought it was very interesting. As a social psychologist, the thing that we're most interested in education is the power of the situation. So, our disciplinary perspective is about how situations can have large effects on people's behavior. And one of the things that we've done, our field has done, is to really zero in on the situation of the classroom. And the big discovery that comes out of a lot of this research is that although people may be in the same classroom, the situation of that classroom can be very different for different folk. And the situation can differ both in its objective elements, in terms of, how the teacher behaves towards certain students. I noticed, for instance, that the instructor, when one student talked, gave that student a lot more attention and allowed her to respond to questions, and there was a sort of back and forth, whereas for another student there was, a quick slate, and the instructor moved on. That kind of microdynamic turns out to be super important in affecting student motivation. For example, when teachers have high expectations, they give students more time to respond, and they engage in that back and forth, and they ask more Socratic questions. When teachers have low expectations, they do subtle other things like move on really quickly, or emit neutral or negative affect. Or, interestingly, give a lot of hollow or vapid praise. One of the big findings in education is that children who are seen as less likely to succeed, for example, minority students, are given more praise. A lot of times they get feedback like, B, great work. And so they're sort of deprived of the opportunity for improvement through critical feedback. So there's these sort of microdynamics, subtle aspects of the teacher's behavior that changes the situation for different students. And I think the skit nicely brought that out. The second way in which the situations can be different for different folk is in terms of people's mental life. The situation is not only something that is objective, but it's in people's psychology, the way people represent it. And for instance, I felt this when I was taking the test, this sort of apprehension or anxiety about, God, if I can't answer all these questions, what is the instructor going to think of me? What will other people think of me? Will I get assigned to the remedial table, as I was? So this kind of mental chatter takes up bandwidth, cognitive bandwidth in the terminology of Eldar Shafir, who talked yesterday. And that can really, it's almost like divide attention and cause people to perform worse than they otherwise might. So there is a power to the subjective situation as well. And for students who come in from vulnerable groups, maybe they're marginalized or from disadvantaged backgrounds or first-generation learners, that apprehension may be greater, understandably so, because there is more of a question of belonging for that group. And so the mental chatter can be larger, and the ability to show what you know may be less. So I think I'll end there.
Thank you. So I'm an economist, and we lack imagination, I think. So I was assuming that I would... No, we definitely do. I'm sorry, Tim, we do. And so when I came into this, I assumed that the role play would be quite artificial, and obviously, to some extent, it was. And some of the more exaggerated comments, etc., the audience clearly saw them for what they are. But what was really interesting, I think, was how, when you were talking to people in the different tables, how it affected how they felt. And it was the small things, the mispronunciation of names, the references to gender when talking about particular subjects, even when you knew it was, blatantly trying to get your back up. It was interesting how many people did react. And in particular, to be sort of asked to do things makes you feel quite defensive. And the other thing that struck me was that the evidence clearly shows the importance of teachers and teaching. It is the core factor in the system. Or one of the most major factors in the system determining pupil achievement. And what was really interesting in this room, even, you're all highly educated adults, and yet the teacher at the front was driving the whole thing, having a huge influence on how you felt about it. And you can really see the power of teachers and teaching, even from that brief experience, which I thought was quite interesting.
That's right. So I guess, based on those initial reflections from my panel, I'd like to throw it out to the participants. In particular, I've sort of noticed I've got some feedback from the roving people around this session who said Table 5 had some particular issues engaged with the task and people feeling particularly uncomfortable, unsettled by the activity. It could be the effective work of my colleague Hannah there, who was the plant on that table. But Andy, or is there anybody on that table who particularly wanted to comment on how they felt or how they engaged with learning as a subsequent all the priming and prompting that happened?
I'll have a go. Yeah, we definitely struggled to engage with the task on this table. For me, I think we were definitely struggling because we had somebody who clearly didn't understand what the task was. Not that any of us did, but anyway. And I think we were struggling with it to know how much to bring her with us, how much to let her sit at the side and maybe just come up with something random, the rest of us all together. So that would be kind of one thought. I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, I think I told her because she was so, anxious to, throw stuff. I said, why do you channel that, you know, coloring stuff? And she did with black, and she started drawing. So I felt like I wanted to, you know, include her, but not, I knew that something was fishy here, but yeah. So I saw myself, you know, reacting that way, and it made me think.
Fantastic. Is there anybody else who wants to have a bit of a reflection on their experience? Or a question you may want to ask one of our panelists based on their experience?
One thing that was different about this to being in a real classroom is ultimately none of us really cared what the outcome was. And in that sense, I think we found it easier to agree because basically we just agreed with the first suggestion in order to get it done and finished. If we'd have been in a real situation where we believed that real grades or our futures were ahead of us, then I think it would have been much harder to get that sense of consensus.
For me, it's more of a question to the panel about the experience that we've seen here. So we've seen how the microdynamics and interactions between the teachers and everyone affected a lot how we felt, how we learned, how we progressed. And I'm wondering how at like a government scale or like at a bigger scale you can control for that or put mechanisms in place so that ultimately all the schools will be as equal as possible at a good level, and you will not have such big differences in how each classroom is handled just based on who happens to be your teacher.
Yep, I'll throw it to anybody in particular want to address that first. If not, I do. One of the interesting comments I really took out of yesterday was the final session with Danny Kahneman and Richard Thaler. So one of the comments that Danny made was around bias training and how you can get people to sort of be aware of it. And so part of his solution to that was getting people to sort of actively reflect for a moment just about the biases that may be at play and how that may necessarily impact their experience with other people and how they engage. So it could be quite interesting at a teaching level. So how do you get people to sort of take that time before they engage that classroom to think about all the different things that they may be doing? It may not have to be necessarily for an extended period of time, but to prompt them to think about these things before they really engage.
I think that's sort of the question, if you like, of the session. And I'm struck by the fact that we know remarkably little about the best way to educate and train teachers anyway, in a general sense, let alone once you get onto the minutiae of and how do you get them to assess particular issues around biases or ways of leading classes. But I think there is an important point in here that is that in the dynamics of a classroom, you cannot control everything. And essentially what you're saying with the teacher is that you are trusting them as a sort of professional, and so it's in their professional education that we should be focused, not in a sort of one-size-fits-all prescribed notion, Ofsted style, of have you ticked your box on bias training. That's really very unlikely to work, I would say.
It's a really hard question and a good question. My answer is twofold. First, I think there are things we can learn from expert teachers and exceptional mentors that once we isolate what they're doing, we can scale them. And there's some examples of this that maybe we can get to later. But just as one example, one of the things that very successful teachers do in urban environments working with minority kids is they make it very clear from the outset that they believe in their kids' ability to reach a higher standard. And that's made explicit from the start. And so the validation isn't in the form of praise, like, I think you're intelligent, which we saw in the skit was played up a lot. That kind of praise seems to backfire because it makes the environment more evaluative. Instead, what these successful mentors do is they emphasize, hey, you have a long way to go, but I believe in you. And over, the message is conveyed that you can succeed if you make the effort, and we'll do it together. So one of the things our lab has done, and also Carol Dweck has done, is to kind of try to pull out that key ingredient in what those teachers are doing. So for instance, we did a little study in which we gave students from an at-risk group critical feedback from their teacher, and the teacher accompanied it with a little note. And the note, these were middle school kids, the note that the teacher gave them said, "I'm giving you this feedback because I believe you can reach a higher standard." That was it. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like a little thing, but from the perspective of a kid who's marginalized, maybe dealing with this sort of mental chatter and doubt, it can be like water on parched soil. And what we found is that that message increased the percentage of children who chose to revise their essay after getting critical feedback on it from 17% to 71%. I think looking at what great success stories do, trying to isolate what they're doing can be helpful. A second approach is to kind of change our goggles. I think when a social psychologist looks at an environment, they see different things. Most of us, when we look at a classroom, we see students, actors, teachers, books, papers, tests. When a social psychologist looks at a classroom, they see norms, group dynamics, identities, selves, meanings. And the very best teachers get this. There's some wonderful research by Mark Lepper, who looks at effective tutors. And it's as though the effective tutors have this deep understanding of the dynamics of a classroom and the experience of being a student in it. So for example, one of the things they do that turns out to be a big surprise is they ask a lot of questions, these expert tutors, when they work with at-risk kids. So about 90% of their utterances are Socratic questions. So the kid has this sort of feeling that they are generating the knowledge themselves. The less effective tutors just kind of get down to business and start lecturing. Another thing that these expert tutors do is they do something that seems, from an outsider's perspective, to be really inefficient. They begin the tutoring session with a little chit-chat. They ask the kid about their values and their hobbies and what they like and dislike. Again, from an outsider's perspective, it seems like, God, this is a waste of time. But from the perspective of the kid, they feel like this teacher sees my full self, and it creates a kind of comfort zone for them to put themselves out there and try without the threat of failure or rejection deterring them. Expert tutors like that produce gains in performance of roughly 2 standard deviations, even working with at-risk kids. If you're asking about an educational intervention that works, there is nothing more effective than expert tutors. Typically, an effect size for an intervention in education that's good is 0.3 standard deviations. Expert tutors, it's 2, with 2 standard deviations working with at-risk kids. They are doing a lot of little things that speak volumes. And one thing I think, so the answer is twofold. One thing that we can do is isolate and scale up these effective strategies that success stories are doing. Another thing is to kind of help instructors change their metaphor of, or their paradigm for instruction. Because in the case of expert tutors, it's as though they have a different metaphor of the student. They see the student as like having a little self that needs to be awakened, versus the less effective tutors see the child almost as a receptacle to pour information into. That was sort of kind of what was brought out in the skit, where you just saw the sort of instructor just kind of pouring information in. That paradigm or that mental frame seems to be a less effective one, especially for working in diverse contexts.
Okay, thank you. I think the challenge is the scale of it, and wanting to move a whole education sector. So I think that really is the challenge. The vast majority of teachers in the classroom are there because they do care passionately about their students and want to support them, but often are using ineffective or ill-informed techniques. And obviously, new research is constantly emerging. So Geoff talks in his work about the 90s, and every teacher was very focused on raising self-esteem. And there was lots of praise randomly. But we believed as a sector that that was the right thing to do, and that was what the research was suggesting. And then new research comes out, and obviously the work that Geoff is working on, and Dweck and Duckford, and that becomes very, very influential. But if you're going to take a whole sector, you can't then just train them once and think that's it. We've done it. We need to be involving teachers in ongoing training. The danger is, and there's a phrase that Dylan Williams at the Institute of Education uses, of lethal mutation. And what often happens in education and schools and colleges is that people like me go out to a conference and they meet someone like Geoff and they read about it and they go back and they try to take all of this very, very complex, very finely tuned research back into the organization, and it becomes a Chinese whispers effect. So I've half understood, or I've taken an element of the research and the work, and I take it back and I share it with the head of teaching and learning, and they take a little bit more, and we have a whole Chinese whispers dilution or misconception or misunderstanding of the nuances, which are so specific, using one word over another word of the note. And that can be quite damaging because people are working in the best interest but haven't had the opportunity and the time to fully digest and understand the sophistication of the research. So I think the more we can support active research that involves academics and practitioners, the more that it's co-developed, the more effective that process is. And I think that's one of the exciting things about working with the Behavioural Insights team, that as a college, it enables us to have a conversation and a dialogue. And I hope that that's a two-way street, that conversation works in both directions.
From our perspective, definitely. But yeah, thank you so much to the three panelists for those reflections. Can I throw back to the crowd, the participants? I think we got two up the front here.
Hello. In different international settings, do you think there is a big difference between the inequality within each of those countries and the and being able to scale up good practice? Because there are some systems that are massively more unequal than others, and some are geared towards an academic elite. And does that sort of eat all of the good practice for breakfast?
That's another interesting question about the sort of causes of educational inequality. What we do know, however, is that educational inequality maps quite nicely onto income inequality as well. So we have to be very mindful that the gap in experience between a very poor child in England and the very richest child is much, much greater than it is in Norway. So it's not about necessarily having an elite education system, although that might play some role, but it's also about the material differences in terms of inequality. We also know that the inequality, at least in the UK and US, emerges very, very young. In fact, it emerges prior to them starting school. And that's really something to reflect on when we're worrying about, if I organise my schools this way or if I organise my schools that way, how am I going to make a difference to these kids' lives? Yes, but remember, they walk into the school with very large differences. And so far, there's a word we haven't mentioned, the R word, resource. And that is a big issue. It's a big issue on the scale up. I mean, it might be that you take your research back and teachers misinterpret, but the other thing is that when you're trying to scale up from a fantastic example of a tutor, how does that work at scale? Well, we know how it works at scale. For example, aspiration is driven by set a child a target grade and report to them regularly how they're doing in terms of that target grade. That's not really what the research suggested would be a good idea, but it's how you scale it. So one of the questions in education research now is, how do you take that base research, do something useful with it, and then evaluate what happens when it really does go into schools at scale? And then we start to tackle inequality.
I think the first order of business is ensuring that students have the resources to learn. And so in regions where there's stark inequality and disadvantage, the first order of business is structural, infrastructural, providing kids with good books, good tutors, and enriching curriculum. So the basic nuts and bolts, brick and mortar stuff of education. That obviously is something that's more of a challenge when there's a lot of economic inequality. But I think that's the first order of business. What the skit, I think, helps to bring home, too, is that that's not enough. That what we need in addition to resources is an understanding of what it's like to experience the classroom from a student's perspective, especially if they're coming in from a disadvantaged background or a stereotype background. What the research suggests is that you can have a lot of resources there, but whether a student avails themselves of it, takes advantage of the resources, uses the critical feedback, depends on their having a growth mindset, having a sort of optimism about their ability to learn.
Great. So just a little bit mindful of time, I saw a couple of other hands up. Can I just see how many questions or comments that we have left? So we've got, I think, 2. What we might do then is, Andy, if we can take those 2 questions together and then we can get the panel to reflect on them together.
Yeah, so just a quick question, because something that I realized is that when the teachers were going around, I was very aware of all the sort of stereotyping cues. And those are ones that we regularly work with. So I'm kind of like, okay, you're telling me the girls are bad at math. However, I noticed that when facing the test, I psych myself into my own stereotyping. I've lived in an English-speaking environment for 15 years. I speak fluent English, and still I was wondering if I wasn't getting the words because I'm not a native English speaker. So I think that we know a lot about how stereotype is triggered in the teacher-student interaction, but I don't know if we have fully grasped it in terms of like sort of the student-to-test interaction, or sort of the student facing something that is school-related, although there is not a person-to-person interaction, which is something that I'm wondering if has been explored at all.
I think the panel will definitely have some reflections on that question. Yes, gentlemen, just over there.
Just another different question. I mean, a lot of this applies to schools' kids, but how about adult education? I mean, in this example, we were all adults, and so the question is whether a lot of what we know about how kids learn translate into adult education and what's different about it.
Yep. So maybe let's sort of go in chronological order if we can have some reflections on that first question. I know, Geoff, you definitely have some comments on sort of that self-stereotyping.
There's a lot of research on stereotype threat by Claude Steele and others, which shows that for students who care about doing well in school, who have an identity, they want to excel, there is this phenomenon wherein they get apprehensive in settings where they feel like they could be judged through the lens of the stereotype. So for women taking a difficult math test or physics test, there's this extra mental chatter for many that goes on in their mind as they're taking the test that, maybe if I do poorly, it could be used to validate this negative image of my group. And that extra mental chatter can take up bandwidth and cause people to perform worse than they otherwise might. A great example of this comes from some nice research by Steve Spencer and Todd Davies, where they show how very subtle, and not so subtle in this case, but sometimes subtle cues in the environment can trigger concerns about the stereotype. So they presented women with a stereotypic commercial. It was a commercial where there was a girl jumping up and down on a bed, excited about a new acne medication, just sort of evoking the gender stereotype of ditziness. And what they found is that after seeing that commercial, that brief 30-second commercial, the women did much worse on a math test than they did in a control condition where they observed a neutral commercial. But what was more terrifying than that was they then asked the students, how interested are you in becoming a mathematician or becoming an economist? And for women who had seen the stereotypical commercial, their interest in those fields plummeted. What that suggests is that these stereotypes can affect not only people's performance, but their preferences. I think one of the things you often hear economists sometimes say is like, well, the supply of women into these fields like science and math isn't so great. Women are just sort of, they prefer not to go into these domains. But what those results suggest is that, well, it might not be such a preference, or that the freedom to choose as may kind of be illusory when society controls the motivation to choose through these stereotypes. So there's a lot of research that suggests that the stereotypes, being a member of a negatively stereotyped group, can kind of create a vigilance to whether I'm stereotyped or not. And one of the things effective interventions do and effective tutors do, or teachers do, like those tutors I mentioned earlier, is that they reassure students that the stereotype's not in play here. I believe in your ability to reach a higher standard. So the stereotype's off the table. I can believe that I'm being seen as a full individual capable of more rather than being reduced to a stereotype.
I was going to focus particularly on the second question around the adult learner, and we've talked a lot about the classroom environment and clearly have set up the classroom environment. But for the adult learner, it's very much about just crossing the threshold into the building, to the college. There's been some anecdotal, I think most of my contribution will be anecdotal, of adult learners seeing lovely glass buildings, college buildings, and feeling that those weren't for them. They were much more comfortable going into a building that looked run down and not invested in because they felt that that was their space, and how actually sometimes the glass indicates to them that that's not for them. So I think there are so many barriers to even getting to the classroom, and we need to be investing much more using the behavioural insights, evidence, etc., to support adult learners into the building, and then the conversations that happen about which courses they may wish to do or what they're looking to achieve. So there's a huge amount that happens before somebody even gets to the classroom and the teacher, and all of those factors will influence their success, I think, in the future.
I'm going to actually talk about adult education interventions in my talk, so we'll come back to that question. But I just wanted to add something about group dynamics. I mean, what was really evident in the skit is the different tone on the different tables and how people were interacting with one another. And of course, anybody who's a parent of a teenager will know the effects of peers. Peer effects are notoriously difficult to estimate in a robust way, but there's no doubt that peers matter. And how peers matter for identity and group dynamics is a really crucial question for the teacher standing in front of the class wanting to know how to best manage what it is now, 33, 35 kids in the class. And we need to have more practical evidence on that.
Brilliant. So thank you to you all for this sort of interactive part of the session. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to wrap up in the last 30 minutes with individual presentations by our panelists. I think they'll definitely incorporate some of the discussion that we've had so far as part of this. So if I could invite Geoff to open things up with his presentation. If you can either do it seat or you can stand. But
yesterday, Dick Thaler talked about these little nudges. The sort of basic mantra is to, if you want to change behavior in some direction, you make it easier for people to engage in that behavior. Usually when we think about intervention, we think about adding forces, adding incentives, adding rewards. With nudges, what you're often doing is lifting a barrier. You're asking a question, well, why hasn't what I wanted happened already? And what's stopping it? And then you sort of intervene to lift the barrier. And so in the classroom, I just want to sort of say, two obvious ways to lift barriers. One is reducing bias and discrimination among teachers. This is perhaps easier said than done, but there's a lot of research showing how teachers' expectations, both in higher education and in middle school and high school, can bias their treatment of certain kids for the worse. So the first order of business is creating more equitable classrooms. Another approach is to design situations that foster motivation, trust, and achievement in scalable ways. And how do you do this? Well, Cialdini and Thaler talked about these little timely nudges, these little sort of timely tips that can kind of steer people in one direction or another. And that's the sort of point of the research that I'll sort of just briefly sketch out today, sort of showing how little nudges given to students at the right time and the right place can do a lot of good. it's not just a nudge, it's a timely nudge. So what we're adding to nudge is this idea of flow, that sometimes if you give a person a nudge at the right time, the right place, maybe that transition to community college or that transition to middle school where they get on a trajectory, if you nudge them at that moment, they enter a flow of forces that takes them down a totally different trajectory from the one they might have had otherwise. That's the basic idea, sort of nudge and flow. They're well-timed nudges, and because they're timely, they can have long-term effects. Okay, these nudges, they awaken a sense in students that I can do it, I belong, or I am a good person. It sounds touchy-feely. It is. This is sort of touchy-feely done right. What are credible ways to convey this message, both in higher education and in middle school and high school? Okay, so one way to do so is to convey this message, I can do it, is through the kind of criticism that I talked about earlier, where simply appending a note that conveys to students, I believe in your potential to reach a higher standard, increase their motivation to revise their essay, and we found much later actually increased their GPA in school. That was an intervention given to middle schoolers at the transition to middle school, and you can see how for a student who's wondering if they belong, getting that message right at the transition to middle school could give them a psychological foothold that helps them to excel. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset similarly sends the message you can do it in a credible way. She and Josh Aronson have shown how reassuring students that intelligence is like a muscle. It's a malleable entity, increases motivational resilience. So through little interventions that convey in word and deed that intelligence is a malleable entity, it's something that can be grown with effort and practice, kids are more likely to do better in school, they get better grades, and they're more likely to stay in school. So that's an example of nudges that send this message or awaken the sense of students that I can do it. Okay, I belong. In research by Greg Walton and David Yeager and others, it's been shown how little timely nudges that reassure students that they belong can go a long way. So to make a long story short, here's what they do. It's the transition to college. During the transition to college, students experience a lot of struggles, and they often wonder, is this a place for me? Here's what the intervention was. For 1 hour, freshmen, first-year students come to the lab, and in that lab, they read the results of a survey of upperclassmen. That survey conveys two messages. First, most freshmen, the survey indicates, as the upperclassmen say in the survey, most freshmen in the transition to college wondered if they belonged. It was normal. The second thing that the survey conveys is that most students with time came to feel as though they belonged in school and they felt at home. So the message conveyed, I come in to the lab and I read this survey of upperclassmen and I learn in this credible way that, hey, if I'm feeling like I don't belong, that's something normal and it's likely to be short-lived. I'm not unique. I am normal, and any adversity that I'm experiencing is apt to be short-lived. And the sort of message is twofold, that this too will pass and I am normal. That is conveyed in a 1 hour intervention in the transition to college, and what is found is that 3 years later, this intervention has improved or continues to improve minority students' GPA. It closes the racial achievement gap at a college by 50%, cutting the gap between minority students and their white peers in half. It's a little intervention, it's a little nudge that goes a long way. What it does, though, is to change the psychological situation for students so that they know that as I'm going through college, if I'm experiencing hassles, threats to my sense of belonging, it's not an indictment on me. It's not a sign that I don't belong here. It's something normal that everyone experiences. It might sort of take the psychological edge off of adversity. Finally, I am a good person. This is research that comes out of Claude Steele's theory of self-affirmation, which says that one of the things that people try hard at in life is to feel good about themselves in a sort of general way, to reassure themselves of their self-integrity. In one intervention that's been tested both in college and in middle school and in high school, what was done was this. Students in their class are given a writing exercise. And in that writing exercise, you're asked, what are your most important values? What do you care about the most? Please circle your most important value, might be religion, relationships, and say why it's important to you. What this does is to give students the opportunity to assert their adequacy and their sense of self-integrity by saying, this is what's important to me, this is what defines me, this is what makes me a good person. My belief in God, my relationships with family and friends, that's what makes me whole. For students who are kind of feeling anxious about school, wondering if they belong, that little exercise can make a big difference and help them to secure a positive self-image in an otherwise threatening transition. What was found is that students who engage in that intervention of writing about a core value do better academically and are more likely to persist in school. So for example, in one study in a college, women who engage in the self-affirmation exercise earned better grades in an advanced physics course, and then were actually more likely to take the second sequence in a physics sequence and go on to physics majors. So these little nudges at the right time and the right place can send people on a positive trajectory. They're not cure-alls. What they do is they allow people to take advantage of the opportunities for learning and growth in their environment, and in the right time and in the right place, they can, these little nudges can shunt people into a positive flow of forces that changes their trajectory. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the FE, the further education sector in the UK, and I just wondered if you could raise your hand if you're familiar with the further education sector in the UK. So I've got the scale of the room. Okay, so quite a lot of people in the room aren't. So further education colleges operate, and we have students primarily from the age of 16 and above, and I'm going to talk about the three typical cohorts of learners, the adult learners, and I did ask the panel what we consider as an adult learner, and I think that there's a difference of opinion about when someone becomes an adult learner as opposed to a learner generally. Yeah, okay, we'll get to my slides in a moment. So I was just going to again give some examples. We're in the middle of recruiting new students at the moment that are walking through the door this morning to say that they want to learn, they want to engage in education. And for one cohort of those students, the 16-year-olds, many of them come to a further education college having directly had a conversation the day before, this cohort of glossy 16-year-olds, where their sixth form teachers have said, A-levels are not for you, you're not for us. And that's the last message that those 16-year-olds, many of those 16-year-olds hear before they walk through the further education college. So to imagine the scale of the damage that a conversation like that has on a young person is a big challenge. We then have, and I've deliberately chosen glossy advert images because these are the images that students see in prospectuses on websites. So do they belong? So do the 16-year-olds who've just been told by their school that they don't belong and A-levels are not for you, sixth form isn't for you, go to the college and see what they can offer? Do they feel that they belong? We then have our 17, 18, 19-year-olds in the middle who walk through the college doors and are very, very anxious about being old at 17 and 18. How lovely to be anxious about that. But they are. And their biggest fear is that they're going to be in a classroom and look really old because they're going to be sat next to 16-year-olds, and therefore they're feeling that they've been held behind. And so that's a big barrier for our new students, our 17, 18, 19-year-olds to overcome. They are adult learners. And then we have the other group that I'm indicating, and those are learners that are 24 plus, that are adult learners also, or mature students that very often have failed at education and walked away from education. And for some reason, something has happened that has enabled them to think, I want to return to education, I want to go back to college, I want to get qualifications, I want to learn a whole range of things. And again, they feel that they're not going to belong because they're going to be with all of these other groups of students. And I think one of the challenges for the UK further education sector is how do we enable all of these very diverse groups of people to feel that they do belong. And clearly there's a lot of work that we do to try and support that. But again, learning from the research that's out there. Sorry, I shall just do it like that. We then talk about the transitions. And again, in the UK sector, there's a very clear distinction between academic education and vocational education, with the college being, or the further education being marked as vocational. And there is a status in the UK that isn't there in lots of other countries, and we look at their education, that vocational is second best. And so, again, there's a transition into supporting students and recognizing that vocational and skills-based training and education is vital and valuable. And that impacts on their perceptions of why they're here, that traditional education was not for them. And then I just want to finish by talking about the good intentions, which I think I covered almost in the question that we had earlier. But teachers have very, very good intentions. And I think that the touchy-feely praise that can be misguided is very damaging, but is also designed to be incredibly supportive. And there are many, many students that benefit from the praise, but it does need to be done right. And supporting our teaching profession to learn from the research. So, as Anna mentioned, there is a resource implication because we do need to continually invest in training and supporting staff in education so that they are benefiting from the latest techniques, nudge theory, etc. It takes 2 years to change the habit of practice of a teacher. So we recognise that 30 days, 2 months to change healthy eating or something like that. I throw that out in a blasé way. But changing the practices of a teacher can take up to 2 years. So it's a very significant journey that we need to go on as a profession, as a sector, that we want to engage in. And I guess my passion or my plea is if we don't invest in that, the loss to individuals is phenomenal. And at the end of every year, we have celebrating events, and you hear these stories of the impact when we get the nudges right, when we do it and it works. It's absolutely hair on the back of your neck transforming. And when we get it wrong, individuals are missing out, but obviously society is missing out hugely on that lost, untapped resource. So I shall conclude with that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the loss, essentially, and the lost potential. The other way of expressing the loss is also to ask why education matters. I'm sure I don't need to talk about that with this audience of the value of education in personal terms, but I think it's also important to think about the value of education in economic terms. And the reason why it's important is twofold. One, obviously, economic value may generate further investment of the type that Fiona was making a plea for. But also, I think we should reflect on the difference between an incentive and a nudge. There is a huge incentive for individuals to invest in education. You don't really get a bigger incentive than this. Education has been found to have positive impacts on health, on civic participation, on crime, on behaviour, but even more crucially, perhaps from the individual's own perspective, has a massive impact on their labour market success, their earnings, and indeed their employment. Just to give you some scale of that, I'm going to put up some numbers there that, if you do an extra year of schooling, your earnings are likely, on average, across countries and across systems to be 10% higher as a result of that additional investment. But maybe when you're young that doesn't mean much, but this sure should. This is the unemployment rate and how it varies by education level amongst a young adult, age 24. And you can see the phenomenal differences in your chances of being in employment depending on your education level. And this should make us stop and think, because young people are not stupid. They can see this, they can feel this, even if they don't have perfect information on the actual value of a degree. They're certainly aware of how much better their prospects would be if they had more education. And yet every year we see children and young people falling by the wayside. We see adults trying to engage with the education system, but we see a lot of loss. And we need to understand that better and also give second chances. At the very other end of the scale, we also know that in our system things are not necessarily equal. This is a slide borrowed from the Sutton Trust work, which looked at the dominance of people from independent schools in public life. And I've just taken a random selection of a few occupations there, showing the percentage of people doing those occupations who attended independent school. I'm not putting it up there to bash independent schools, but I am putting it up there to sort of, again, illustrate this point that everywhere in our society, it's incredibly visible, the value of education and what it means in terms of your occupations and your career. There's no shortage of sort of clear, visible evidence that investing in education, in this case, in private education, really pays off for the individual. And what we have to do is develop nudges that can bridge the gap between people's abstract understanding of this fact and their reality, and that has to be bridged so that we can get people back into education when they've dropped out. Now, the reason why I say get people back into education is that we're talking about individuals who didn't respond to the incentives in the system as they went through and who potentially dropped out at 16 or 18 or 19 without educational success. That might be partly because they're a teenager and partly because our system has bits of it that are set up to potentially prompt failure. But when you're an adult, of course, you get past some of that, but not all of that, and now you start to think about your future, and that's when a lot of people potentially come back into the education system. And that, of course, is why it's vital to invest in adults at that point. What we found, however, of course, is that if you invest in a child's education very early on, you tend to get a good return on that investment, and by good return I mean it tends to be effective, it often improves their academic achievement. So early investment, early interventions in whether it's nursery education or early years programs or primary school have, both here in the UK and in the US, proved to be quite effective at improving pupils' achievement. That sort of led to a false dichotomy, I think, of having to choose between early investment and late investment. But actually, if you read that evidence carefully, it doesn't suggest that early investment is the be-all and end-all. It suggests that if you invest in children early, but then don't do any further investment, they don't actually do that well. There's one example, for example, an early years program in the US that was evaluated quite comprehensively. And although the intervention itself had an immediate short-run impact on children's achievement, which was good, for those children who went on to lower quality secondary schools, the effects of that intervention sort of fade and wash out. So it is a false dichotomy to say we should invest early or should we invest late. We need to invest both early and late, and recognize that if we can get children earlier, our job is easier, but we need to sustain that investment if we're going to make a difference in the long term to their lives. And we've got to think about that really carefully as a state. So now comes the tricky part. Okay, so I've made the case, I hope, that we need early investment, we need late investment, and we certainly need to think about investing in adults who haven't succeeded in the system in the first place. The problem then comes in the reality of that, because we have spent, in this country at least, a large amount of money over the years, various training programs, various adult skills programs. Skills for Life was a very, very big program. Train to Gain was another multi-million pound investment. Many of them have not proved particularly effective. If by effective you mean increasing people's qualification rates and subsequently their employment and their earnings. There has definitely been mixed success at best. This should not stop us trying at all. I mean, I'm definitely not advocating that we shouldn't invest in adult education or FE on the back of this evidence. But what's happened is we spent a lot of money. Much of it was never evaluated in terms of the impact it had on adults. So we're left a little bit at sea as to what to do to really improve the skills of adults. But what we also know is that training by firms often tends to be relatively valuable. And that's even allowing for the fact that they tend to train their better workers. But even when you take account of that, firms seem to know how to do certain types of training. And I think that we need to think about that carefully and learn from their experience in the state education sector. But what we also know is that if you're not building on a good base of basic skills, the whole thing gets much, much trickier. And the work that we've done shows that basic skills is potentially the problem in the system, actually, for very low-skilled adults and those who have dropped out of education. Our work shows that basic skills have huge economic value to the individual and obviously to society, and that individuals without those basic skills in literacy and numeracy really do quite badly in the labour market. And the problem is, of course, as anybody who works in an FE college will know, trying to upskill and encourage people to get qualifications if they don't have that basic level of literacy and numeracy is an incredibly difficult task. And so one of the things, or one of the lessons I think we need to take from this is that you need to do a lot of investment in literacy and numeracy early, but it's never too late to continue that investment. And we know it will pay off for individuals in the labour market. And we just need to get much better at designing interventions that can help us improve the skills of these adults. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the three speakers for their presentations there. I guess for this particular session today, we really wanted to try something different, to get you to look at the behavioural science aspect of it really from the eyes of the learner. And I think what we wanted to do in the immersive session is to show you the impact of not getting it quite right. And I think sort of the presentations that came after that, Geoff, I guess, offered some solutions, the potential interventions that we could do to help overcome some of these aspects. Fiona shared with us the impact on the different impact of these things on different age groups and how they impact them differently. And I think that was a perfect wrap up for Anna in terms of the more systematic impact when we don't necessarily get this stuff right. So I think, it'd be interesting to hear your reflections after this as we sort of move towards the break. But first of all, I wanted to thank our panellists for their contributions to it. I think that was really insightful, and I'm taking a lot away from this in terms of how the Behavioural Insights team moves forward with its work. The next group, I wanted to thank the actors and the plants throughout the audience for their contribution, particularly in the early part. But then last of all, I especially wanted to thank the participants because you were just as much part of the session as everybody else. So can I just get a round of applause for everybody who was around?